Today, my guest and I discuss miniature wargaming and the Wild West.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Okay, guys, I have an awesome interview coming up. But first, if you could help out the show some way, I would greatly appreciate it. If you could like, rate, review, or subscribe to the show wherever you are listening to it, that would be phenomenal because those things help the show out immensely. They help people find the show, and that's really what I would like, more and more people to find this show so that these interviews could help more game masters and more role players up their games. Also, if you would like to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. That would be incredibly appreciated, and I would love you to join my other patrons. Fantastic patrons, I should add. Now, here is the interview. My guest today is the owner of Knuckleduster Miniatures, Forrest Harris. Forrest, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you just kind of start us off? I don't play too many miniatures games, but what kind of got you into the scene of creating miniatures games before we kind of talk about, more specific stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I grew up, in the late 70s and the 80s and got into wargaming miniatures. Started to, read stuff like Wargamers Digest and started painting, learning how to paint miniatures, and tabletop wargaming was my thing. As an adult, started playing, and I'd always been an artist, from the time I was a kid. And so eventually those two interests just started to intersect, and I started to learn to sculpt. And I learned to sculpt the traditional way with green stuff putty. And lo and behold, in the early 2000s, I felt brave enough to launch my own product line, a little nascent product line of Wild West miniature sort of townspeople and stuff that no one else made. I wasn't going to go head to head and try to compete with the big guys. So I just kind of made these little filler figures, I did ZZ Top as a saloon band, calling the Sharp Dress Band. I did a little stuff like that, goofy stuff. Idiot Deputies was one of my first packs. And it features sort of a Don Knotts reaching into his shirt pocket for his one bullet and one guy looking down the barrel of his rifle, wondering what's wrong. So I did stuff like that, and it didn't require a lot of expertise. I call it my Wallace and Gromit phase because they were sort of Gumby figures. But, people bought them. I had somebody else make them for me. I want to give a shout out to one of the nicest guys, a true gentleman in our industry named Don Perrin, who used to be president of Gamma many years ago. And he taught me how to make molds and how to cast and encouraged me to get my own equipment, which I did. And I just continued through trial and error, improving my skills, and eventually had myself a little line of, gunfighters and everything. From there, I started looking for other things I could sculpt. And when 2012 came around, I sculpted a line of War of 1812 figures for the 200th anniversary. And I'm still selling those. That went really well. And of course, all this was hand sculpted, and I did the vulcanized mold making. And for those who aren't familiar, wargame miniatures and role-playing miniatures, the metal ones are generally spun in a 9-inch round mold under pressure, so that with centrifugal force. And that's called spin casting. You probably heard that referred to. Mm-hmm. So I did spin casting. So I have always made my own molds and done spin casting. And I got to the I suppose it was about 2014, I would say. And I realized that digital thing was coming on strong. It was already really common in fantasy miniatures for things to be digitally sculpted. And I thought, I have to learn to do this because this is going to take over our industry eventually. And so I started teaching myself through YouTube videos and everything else. And I bought the right stuff. I bought ZBrush, which is the industry gold standard for sculpting game figures. Learned how to use it and started sculpting a Wild West line called Gunfighter's Ball. And that brings me up to the present because I've been doing that for about 7 years now, I guess. And our product line is about 140 some gunfighters and about 40 different bystander characters. And we have accessories and everything else. And this is, of course, all 28 millimeter / 32 millimeter. It's modern game scale, what you would find in anything like Reaper or Copplestone or anything like that.
Okay. No, that's awesome. And I definitely want to follow up on some things that you said there because you kind of gave us a good rundown there. When you were a kid, what do you think it was about the war games and stuff that drew you? Was it the actual miniatures and kind of also, I assume, the imagination kind of surrounding those figures and that?
Well, it was a combination of things. I think, just as some of your listeners will have gotten fascinated with Marvel or with Tolkien or with, Star Wars or whatever their particular thing was, the thing that I latched onto for a reason best known only to the cosmos is like Napoleon. Excuse me, I just bumped my microphone. It's like Napoleon and stuff like that. That era, the Napoleonic era, is what first fascinated me. And I don't know. I think maybe it was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang or The Wizard of Oz, one of the other that had some sort of toy soldiers in it, or The Wizard of Oz had the guards there at the castle. Maybe that was it. There was something in the back of my mind that just really liked that, toy soldier look and the shakos and plumes and. So I latched onto that when I discovered there was such a thing as, oh, yes, I'll tell you what, the moment that I discovered wargaming, Time magazine had an article, a one-page article on a wargaming convention. It was called The Guns of August. I don't know where this convention was. I think it was in Ann Arbor, Michigan is where it was, but I don't know what it was. And it would have been about 1977, maybe. And they had a picture of a guy kneeling down at eye level with his troops. And he had these Napoleonic French infantry in march attack that just looked like toy soldiers. And they were 25 millimeter tall or 30 millimeter figures. And that picture just fascinated me. I was like, I have to learn more about this. I have to do this.
No, that's awesome. And I think that is a famous picture because I think I have seen that picture with the person looking through the toy soldiers, but I could not have connected it to Time magazine or to a wargaming convention, but I think I have seen that picture. And that's just kind of interesting. And of course, the Napoleonic era seems to be kind of a quite I don't know if it just seems that wargaming or miniatures wargaming is kind of quintessentially Napoleonic, or at least
I've always thought so.
Yeah,
but I found that in finding, in my as an adult playing games with other people, it's kind of hard to find Napoleonic opponents. It's sort of a, people really love World War II, the Civil War. I find here in the Midwest anyway, a lot of people only really like to play games for periods that Americans were involved in for some reason. So I have a hard time sometimes finding Napoleonic games, but we do have a small group of us here in our town that do play Napoleonics.
Yeah, no, that's just interesting. And then, you said you started painting the figures in that, and I think there's just kind of always a fact, I remember, when I was a kid painting, model cars and things. And then, realizing that there were, I think at some point, D&D figures that you could paint was like mind blowing to me or something,
Yeah.
and so that, I don't know, that's just interesting to me as well, that, kind of you as an artist kind of drawn to, kind of painting the figures as well.
Yeah. I mean, Wargamers Digest probably told me that I had to paint them. I looked there, and of course they were all black and white.
Sure.
But I had no idea how to. What younger listeners won't perhaps key into is that there was no YouTube.
Yeah.
Getting information, there's no internet. So getting information on how to do something was really hard.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to do. I tried to use watercolor paints when the first Raoul Partha miniatures I tried to paint. And of course I ruined it. It was like, got all gunked up with this stuff. I was like 11 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next thing I tried was an oil enamel house paint we had.
Oh, wow.
So mixed, I just didn't know. There was there was a model railroad hobby shop in the nearby town, but he wasn't much help.
No. Well, I was going to say, I mean, that is something, not having YouTube, and I've talked about this in some other contexts on the show before, just like with learning how to play Dungeons and Dragons, like I just had no idea how to do it. But now you can just go to YouTube, and I had a similar experience with, model cars or model trains. It was just like, I would ask like an older cousin, and he had some knowledge, and then you would go to the model train or the hobby shop, and you would ask them, and maybe one guy painted figures or painted model trains, and he would give you a little bit more information. But now, I mean, there are just dozens of YouTube channels that tell you how to do all of this amazing effects and make things look like they're worn out and dirty, and make things look like they're brand new, all kinds of stuff like that. It's just awesome. Yeah. And so, I'm just kind of fascinated by that as well. And I know I let some of my younger friends know that it's just like, we just didn't know how to do anything.
That's right.
Unless,
right. Yeah.
We just had to figure it out or find, a person, who did it, and try to learn from there. So, I don't know. I just find that interesting, as well. But now, you said when you first started kind of making some, why did you choose to make Wild West figures?
I think it was because I hurt my back, and I was down for a few weeks, and I just was watching. They started running like Western on like whatever cable station I was watching. I was like, okay, I'll watch this. So I ended up watching a bunch of John Wayne movies and a bunch of Clint Eastwood movies. And I went through a period where I was like, I was really into that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I knew that I wasn't good enough just starting out. I wasn't about to try to take on, the project of making an army. Mm-hmm. I know I wasn't good enough for that. So I thought, well, here's something I can do. I had a few Wild West figures I'd bought to game with. I thought, well, what don't they make? Well, they don't make, at that time, they didn't make a lot of bystanders and stuff. So I was like, well, that's what I'll do. I'll make some bystanders. I can't, even if they aren't very good, it's the only thing available. So there's a little bit of, I've always been very mindful of what will sell, so I've always had a bit of a business mentality too. Mm-hmm. I'm not passionate about the West, I guess you'd say, maybe. I'm passionate maybe about the history I am, but not about the movies. I didn't grow up with all those Westerns. My customers are older than me, but for the most part. And they're guys who grew up with the 50s Westerns, and they know this stuff backwards and forwards. And I know the history pretty well, but I don't, I don't have that extreme passion that people of that era have for, for the movies and everything. Mm-hmm. But I looked at it and I said, this is a winner. This is something I can run with. Also, even though I have an appreciation for fantasy miniatures, the skill level where I was at, in order to be competitive with fantasy figures, you'd be really good. And I was just starting out. So that wasn't going to be a very good plan.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of competition in that area. I know that.
Many are called, but few are chosen.
Yeah, and it is interesting the way you talk about westerns like that, because I kind of know what you mean, because I was, I grew up mainly in the, in the 80s, late 80s. And, there was always, westerns kind of around, but they were never, they had fallen kind of out of the main kind of, kind of out of the mainstream, if you will, I guess, as far as, movies and stuff. But I always do, I do enjoy them. And I've watched probably more than, than I care to admit, but, especially some of the famous Western movies and that. But it is interesting that you say that that puts like your clientele or the people who buy your figures are older because they grew up when Western was the dominant genre.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I try to accommodate, their requests and so forth. I've made, but it has to intersect with what I'm interested in. So, like The Magnificent Seven was an incredible piece of film. It really was. It was way ahead of its time as a piece of cinematic art, for one thing. The original one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So, that's a movie I could get excited about, and everybody wanted those figures. So that was easy. And of course, it was not The Magnificent Seven. It was the Spectacular Seven.
Yes.
And all
copyrights, trademarks, all that stuff.
Exactly. Most of the really iconic John Wayne movies, I love those movies. Say what you want about John Wayne, but the movie's a movie. And then Clint Eastwood movies, and then stuff like Tombstone and Young Guns, and there's, all of those. That's where it intersects my interests and their interests. Now, when you get back into the 50s and 60s and some of the TV shows, I just have to look at them because I don't know much about them. And I'd look at the costuming. If that's something, it looks like it would be a cool character to sculpt. Like I just sculpted one. I believe he's called Jingles in the show, whatever the show was. I think it was the Wild Bill Hickok, where Wild Bill Hickok had short hair and no mustache.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, it was an old black and white Western, and they made him squeaky clean. Of course, Wild Bill Hickok was a drunk, and yeah. I'll stop there. That is many interests. And accidentally gunning down his own deputy. That was another one of his escapades. Saw out of the corner of his eye somebody running towards him in this crowd when he was trying to control this unruly crowd. And he spun and shot. It was his own deputy. Anyway, this character he was fat, and it's always fun to sculpt a fat guy, and everybody loves a miniature of a fat guy. That's always appreciated in miniatures. Anything exaggerated is always appreciated. So
learning stuff today. I'm learning stuff.
He was sort of this guy had, he looked like a rodeo clown would look, not like a real fat guy, but like somebody who had a hula hoop under his pants. And anyway, I called him Spangles instead of Jingles, and it was a fun sculpt to do. The costume work. So that was perfect. My customers wanted that guy. I thought the costuming was a winner, and the character was cool looking. And so that happened to work. Now there's some times where I get requests for characters that the costuming is exactly the same as every other Western from the 50s and 60s. It's the dime store cowboy hat and the ironed jeans and the tight shirt and the Hollywood holster, which never existed in the Old West. The one piece holster that has the stitching around it. That's another dime store item there. Dime store holster. So those I look at and I'm like, I've already done several guys like that. Most miniatures lines only do archetypes. They don't do every single character with the same costuming.
Sure.
So I'll take a pass on a lot of those characters.
Mm-hmm.
Then sometimes I know they'll be a big seller. So like Chuck Connors had that exact getup that I just described. However, he had a really interesting face, and he was a tall, lanky guy, and he had an unusual Winchester. So I thought, yeah, that's a good one. And he was one of those. Again, I never saw The Rifleman, but he was that was one of the iconic characters from that era. So I went for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know. I guess, you were saying that they made, Wild Bill Hickok kind of squeaky clean for a TV show. And I'm sure there were examples of that, but this brought up totally a tangent, but some newer Westerns, and I won't name any names, but some newer Westerns, it seems like the actors playing those guys don't, can't pull off the tough guy or the real cowboy kind of. Well, I mean, Gary Cooper was actually a cowboy, and even with John Wayne and some of these other guys, some of the older actors who looked like they were men who lived outside and worked hard. And some modern movies are like, okay, I get it. You came out of an acting class, and and you don't look like you've worked outside a day in your life. I get it.
Yeah. I mean, I get that from some of these. It's like, I really like Chris Pratt. He does great. His characters are very entertaining, but it's really hard to believe that he's a badass gunfighter. You know what I mean? But you take Yul Brynner. Well, Yul Brynner was a dancer primarily.
Yeah.
But you take Lee Marvin.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Or Lee Marvin brawled so he got in bar fights. You're not finding many of those kind of guys among the current crop of actors. Yeah. I thought Denzel Washington made a pretty good gunfighter. He had some gravitas, and that's what you want. I think that's what you're describing as gravitas.
Yeah. And I think so. You mentioned like Yul Brynner, and I believe like you said, I think he was a dancer, but like they just had a screen presence, or like you're saying, Denzel, he can sell you on anything, right? Like, he's right. He's like one of the best in the world. Right. So, I think that's something, like you're saying, is this gravitas or the screen presence that you need to kind of pull off that kind of look, and that kind of feel to somebody. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the Ballad of Buster Scruggs.
Okay.
Did you see that?
I think I have. I'm not very familiar with it though.
Netflix. It was a Coen Brothers film, and it was split into 5 short stories. And each one of them was completely different from the other. And they nailed the Old West. They really did the real one, the historical. Plus, they put that twisted Coen Brothers thing in it that was creepy. And you couldn't always put your finger on why. And sometimes it was obvious why it was creepy. But they did an outstanding job. Mark Twain could have written those 5 stories. Yeah. And some of your listeners have probably seen it. But there were great characters in there, and I wouldn't be surprised if at least 1 or 2 of those make their way into our product line.
Okay. And now, that brings up something else that you've been kind of touching on is you are taking some of these archetypes and stuff from these movies and putting them into the miniatures, because that's what people are looking for, right? Yeah. And there's always differences. I always incorporate little differences in there, and I never call them by name. Sure. There was a miniatures company that made a line of superheroes, and they made them look just like the superheroes. But of course, superheroes have just tight costumes. You just paint the logos on them, right? So, but they were doing fine. The only time they got hassled a little bit was when they went so far as to call their Batman character the Caped Crusader. Oh, they couldn't do that. And they said, and the company said, DC said, look, you can make that figure. We don't care. Just don't call it the Caped Crusader. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what they ended up calling it, but that was instructive to me. There's not much money in what we're doing compared to, it really isn't compared to, and if I was doing board games, let's say at the level of Cool Mini or Not, or one of those companies. So at that level, you really are making a product that it's going to a lot more people. It's got a lot
more visibility. And particularly if you use the images in your advertising, I think that could probably be a problem too. And especially if it's a living person.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, those are the kind of things you just want to use some good judgment about it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I prefer the historical characters, and I've done many of them, but they never do sell quite as well. Yeah.
So like what's some historical characters?
Well, I've done Wild Bill Hickok.
Okay.
And I've done Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp. Of course, my Wyatt Earp looks an awful lot like Kurt Russell. I've done Annie Oakley, Buffalo Bill, then a bunch of people no one would probably know. Like I did the Frontier Scouts or the Plainsmen. So this is from the era where guys grew their hair long and wore buckskins and really liked to. They would work for the army as scouts and stuff like that. So. One of them was Al Sieber and Honest Jim Baker. And there were just these guys that I guess to the untrained eye, you'd maybe look, I think it was maybe a mountain man, but they'll wear the buckskins and the long hair, and they generally have a big old droopy mustache. And they were experts at, reading the terrain, and they knew all the stuff that about the wildlife and the weather and everything else. They were just consummate frontiersmen. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I will do stuff like that. I love doing that. And then I also love getting into the Weird West category. I have a lot of fun playing around with stuff, and I like doing funny subjects. I've got a character called Groinshot Mcgee. I was going to give him a different name. I was going to call him Lucky, but a friend of mine said, it's got to be Groinshot Mcgee. Okay. What it is it's a guy with a boilerplate, like you might see on a Warhammer figure, just a big old bulky boilerplate. And he's wearing it hanging from his belt to protect his groin. And it's because the game has random hit locations and you can get hit in the groin. I've got a very old customer of mine, one of the first guys to encourage me in this whole endeavor, named Rob from the Chicago area. And he would, at Little Wars, he would scream groin shot at the top of his lungs whenever a hit location was rolled up there. So anyway, Groinshot Mcgee. And then I have, I did a Saloon Gal Gunfighter version of Cardi B, which I call Dicey Lee. Dicey Lee has, Saloon Gal outfit, and she's carrying a sawed-off shotgun. And I have a sort of a Katy Perry, well, it is Katy Perry gunfighter called California Kate.
That's nice. Those are really cool. And I was, you mentioned kind of the Weird West kind of there. I was, I don't know, it was a few years back, or, maybe even a number of years back now, but like I was kind of surprised, but not surprised when I saw kind of the development of the Weird West kind of when I first learned about it, because I was like, well, of course you would mix fantasy with with Westerns because they're awesome. It's just like they go together. Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, the original role-playing games, the very, high fantasy was the very first thing. Mm-hmm. And you've got, the original D&D and everything. It had Tolkien to draw from, and it had, Mallory and had all the Arthurian legends and everything else to draw from. And so there's wherever you find a rich, an era that's rich with mythology and stories and so forth, that's always a fertile ground for role playing. I would imagine. So yeah, in order to, when you can tap into that to find, it's just fun to mash things up, to mash up fantasy and something else.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and it does work in just kind of a strange way. And of course, now we've seen also, World War II with like werewolves and vampires, and and World War One with trolls and elves and stuff. And so I just think, like you were saying, anything that's kind of rich in mythology and then conflict as well, because you can just create just so many stories out of it. Western, right? I mean, it's just always some big conflict, or some even maybe a small conflict, but there is a story in, who has, the rights to the water in the valley, right? How many,
right.
And it's just, it just creates a story right there. And, kind of taking some of those other elements in is a lot of fun. And a gang of, orc outlaws, with Winchesters and, Colts is just awesome, right? Like, it's just really cool. Yeah.
I've sculpted orc gunfighters.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
There's the pack I sell called the Orc Amigos. It's got Wyatt Orc. I can remember their names. There's Wyatt Orc. I don't know, but I have 3 of them. And each one of them, it evolved because I was making a free giveaway figure every year at Adepticon. And so I made one. And then finally, after 3 years, I had a set of 3. And so I just put them in a blister pack, and I have this set that I sell.
Nice. No, that is really awesome. I did not know that. And so when I just said Orc Gunfighter, that is really cool. So no, and then Wyatt Orc is just out of control.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I have some that I roughed them in and never finished the sculpt. I was just looking through a directory the other day. I was like, oh, I never finished those, because I have a couple more loaded up, ready to go. One of them is David Lee Roth as an orc gunfighter with assless chaps.
Oh gosh. Okay. I cannot get that image out of my head now. Thank you, Forrest. Yep. Thank you. David Lee Roth. Okay. So I'm getting the sense that you love mashing up lots of things.
Oh yeah. Well, here's the thing. Okay. Gunfighter's Ball, maybe it's a good segue to Gunfighter's Ball. Sure. I don't know a lot about entertainment, but I know that when people are laughing, they're having a good time. Yeah. So if you're running a role-playing game and people are laughing, they're enjoying it. Mm-hmm. If and things that make you give you a headache are not fun. So I would rather err on the side of humor and simplicity. After many years, a Napoleonic wargamer, I mean, that's the definition of tedious right there. I mean, that's the image that most people have of Napoleonics is, oh, that's tedious. Yeah. And it's because there were a lot of tedious rules back in the 80s and 90s. And anyway, so with the Old West games, they typically happen no matter how it's set up, no matter what rules are being used, people take it away from the game master and make it fun. They want to have fun. They want to laugh. So they don't ever take it seriously. They don't really, quote, get into the characters from a serious standpoint. They lampoon them as they do them. They love the movie quotes. They love to throw around, just jokes. And so when we designed Gunfighter's Ball, we wanted to make a game that you could pretty much play drunk. I mean, it's a game that it takes the complexities and places them within game mechanics that just sort of happen automatically. For instance, hit locations. Real gunfights are an adrenaline dump situation. People get tunnel vision. People just start firing shots. It's rare that somebody has the presence of mind and ability to stay calm and aim. That's the exception, not the rule. So hit locations are random with the exception of called shots. So for the most part, you draw a card out of a card deck and it tells you everything you need to know about what just happened. And that card, by doing that, you don't flip through a bunch of charts constantly. There's like 1 or 2 key charts that you'll use just to get your fire modifiers, and lay down the shot. But other than that, a lot of stuff is card driven. There's character cards that describe, instead of rolling up a character or, spending time developing a character, you get a card. It tells you everything you need to know. But if you want to design a character of your own, there's cards for that. So each card has an ability on it or a characteristic. And you can either sort through them and choose them, or you can even at the beginning of the game deal them out to people, and they get like 3 cards and get to choose one. Maybe pass one to the left to screw your neighbor. So there's just a lot of flexibility in the game, and a lot of things that are fun about it. You keep track of hit points with poker chips, and we sell clay composite poker chips for that, for those who want to use them. So you've got 9 lives, which is 9 poker chips, and it's got 3 reds and 6 whites. After you burn through the whites, when you start hitting the reds, then the chart, you move to a different section of the chart. See, you take bad modifiers. So in other words, it's very visual, and it's tactile, and it's just automatic.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to check a number on a sheet and say, oh, I'm at 64%. My health level is 65. So I guess I down 1. Okay, what's that? Oh, that's a column shift. Wait a minute. I have to look this up. There's none of that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. No, it sounds really cool. And, obviously a lot of my listeners are role players and play, D&D and other role-playing games. And I'm sure there's some miniature players out there as well. But, like I said at the beginning, I don't play miniatures too often. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think they're really cool, but and I always love the figures. So it's interesting to hear you talk about then how that combat is resolved by drawing a card, and it's going to have the action on there, as right on there for Gunfighter's ball. So like if I say I shoot somebody, then I just pull a card, and it's just going to tell me, oh, okay, you shot the guy in the.
Not quite. No. You do have to roll to hit.
Okay.
You'll go, okay, it's 9 inches. That's short range. And there's I kept the list of modifiers as short as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If there was a question about whether it was useful, we threw it out. We just kept the biggies. And you just roll up. You have this one key chart that shows at that distance, you need this % to hit with this kind of weapon. And the weapons are very abstracted: pistol, rifle, shotgun, hunting rifle, Derringer, those kind of categories. Mm-hmm. And you look it up and you go, okay, and use percentile dice to find your 2 hit. So yeah, you roll it up with percentile dice. If you hit, then you draw the card, and then that card tells what happens. And then you might roll dice for damage. It'll say, for instance, maybe a sucking lung injury, and it'll say roll D3 plus 3. And we actually have 6-sided D3s, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. We sell them, little yellow Coppola dice. And those are really handy because sometimes you really only have 3 choices, good, bad, or tied, or something like that, Yeah. And so, but anyway, when you have 9 hit points, you don't want to be rolling a D6 or a D20 or something, because then you'd have to probably look it up on a chart. Like if you were rolling D20s, you can't just take the number and subtract that many poker chips, or you'll be gone after 1 turn. So you would have to use a chart or something to find out the amount of damage if you used a D20. So if you use a D3, you're going to have 1 to 3 health points that you lose out of 9. And if you want it to be more severe, some of those really bad wounds, I think the worst wounds are a D3 plus 3. Some of your listeners will remember Deadlands, and Deadlands made a lot of use of different kinds of dice with an add-on, with plus 3, plus 2 or something. They would change the severity or the impact of the dice that way. So yeah, you'll have you may have a prescribed number of hits, 1 or 2, and then you may have D3 hits, or you may have D3 plus 1, D3 plus 3. So that way we can put the severity on the cards too. So yeah, there's more to it than just drawing the card, but the card will describe the wound, and it will describe what effects it has on the rest of the game for you. Like, for instance, maybe from that point on, you can only move half, or from that point on, you can't use that hand, like your right hand or your left hand, or the gun was shot out of your hand and destroyed. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. That the variations there. Now, when you're putting together a game like this, I assume you've played a lot of tabletop role-playing games as well, right?
Really, no.
No? Okay.
I mean, I'm familiar with how role-playing games work. I'm familiar with how I've taken role-playing game rules and just torn them apart and analyzed them up and down one way and another. But I had a writing partner who brought in the role-playing experience.
Okay.
Brian Martin. And he's a really sharp guy. He's the co-author of Gunfighter's Ball.
Okay.
So he kept that perspective in my thinking as we would play test the game and so forth. Well, see, I had noticed early on when I would put on as a civilian before I was in the game industry, when I used to run Wild West games for people, they just naturally started role playing. And so it just cried out for something that had a role playing element to it.
That's interesting. So people who are playing the war games just really started role playing.
Yeah. I mean,
right.
they would approach it. So it's the differences are really that it's not cooperative, it's competitive. So people are playing against each other. That's the first big difference. The game master, though, here's a similarity. The person running the game is always interpreting things and making comments and helping people make sense of what just happened. So maybe there's a really wild result gets rolled up on the chart and they say, well, here's what happened and here's how that can happen. It hit. The reason that didn't kill him is because, that probably hit the change in his pocket, or it hit, whatever. They'll make up something. But so that's very similar about it. And I think that may be what has enabled it to become like a role-playing game, is that action. And the more that the person running the game has that orientation, the more it will take on that characteristic. You could have a guy who's just a rules lawyer, who's just there to judge the mechanics of the game, and the whole thing would be very dry. But I don't think it ever would be, because the Old West there's such a shared cultural knowledge about the Old West, and everybody's head is just full of all this lore and everything. So they would just naturally start, I've seen it. I mean, I've put this game on hundreds of times and run countless demos at shows, and it's always the same. People, unless it's somebody really young, maybe a teenager who just doesn't have any frame of reference. I've seen that happen only a few times, but most people have such a rich knowledge of the Old West or the Old West movies that they just jump into it right away.
Yeah, and I think that just makes sense if you are such a fan of the genre that you would want to be there, right? I mean,
yeah, right. If you're walking by our booth at a show, if it catches your eye, you must already, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, it's just, I mean, fans of Tolkien love Dungeons and Dragons because you can basically be in that world. And, so I imagine that fans of 1950s and 60s Westerns just want to slip into the world of Gunfighter's Ball because they feel that's their thing, right? That's what they've imagined being a cowboy or a gunfighter or something like that probably a million times already.
Yeah. And then it's been reinterpreted through the years. And, there's always a new crop of people that have been exposed to it in their own way. So that's very interesting.
Yeah. No, that's, and of course, I mean, I can see why then even the hobby of role-playing games sprang out of wargaming, right? Because there were people who wanted to know what was going through the minds of those people on the board. And of course, the role-playing games just sprang out of wargaming, at least initially, right? Because
they were making I've spent a lot of time in the Chicago area at conventions and so forth, and then gotten to know people in the industry who were around back in those early days and acquainted with the guys who made Dungeons and Dragons and everything. And yeah, it was clear that they were historical gamers, but they had been playing a lot of medievals. Mm-hmm. What did they call that? Was it Tactica? Or maybe, I can't remember the name of it, but there was a medieval rule set that they had been using. Mm-hmm. And I think that was sort of where the seed was planted. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. So it is, we're playing with toys ultimately, and role playing is just another kind of playing. It's a childlike sense of play that we get out of our hobby, and it can be expressed in different ways. And I thought the thing that when I was a teenager, I always wanted the miniatures were the thing about D&D that I found fascinating. And once I realized you really don't need the miniatures, you wanted to do more with them. I think that's where Warhammer came from. That's my theory of where Warhammer must have come from, because somebody must have looked at these cool miniatures and went, man, you got to be able to do something else with these. What can you do with them? I want more of them. Oh, you can play a whole battle with them.
Probably, because I know a lot of people who love D&D, but are very much drawn to the Warhammer figures. And I know one person who doesn't play, but just paints them all, and just loves the idea of painting the figures, and to express some creativity in us, a hobby. It's just I don't know. I just think I find kind of all of this fascinating, because there's just multiple levels. There are people who play intensely, like in wargaming, who don't want to role play. There are people who play war games that want to role play, and there are role players who kind of lean to the tactical side and do it a little bit more like a war game. And then there are people who just don't get to play very often, but enjoy another part of the hobby through collecting or something like that.
It's interesting. So miniature wargaming, when we encounter in our groups, when we encounter somebody who only approaches it as a mechanical game, like those people, we call them rule lawyers. We disparage them, and we don't like playing with them. They're tedious to be around. They're irritating. That's not what we do. It's because, just like role-playing games, even though on the surface it's competitive, it really is cooperative, because what we want is to see the result turn out like it might have in history. And you have to cooperate to make that happen, because if somebody exploits a rule and does something very unrealistic, it just spoils it for everybody. It breaks the fourth wall. And we say, but that's not what would have happened. Well, the rules don't say you can't do that. All right. Okay, you can do that. So that kind of person is just not very welcome in our community. You don't encounter them real often either. Mm-hmm. They usually are coming from outside. And board gamers, I'll find that sometimes board gamers have a hard time understanding wargaming because of that. I think. I mean, that's one of the reasons.
Okay.
Is because they want a game.
Yeah.
And clearly what we're doing isn't just a game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I could definitely see that too. Cause, I've definitely encountered people who tried, back in the day, especially, years ago, who tried to approach, say, Dungeons and Dragons or another role-playing game like it was a board game. and you're like, this doesn't work. It doesn't work. And you've just drained all of the spirit out of what we were doing. What you might be doing things correctly, but you've just drained all of the spirit out of what we were trying to do here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, now, in addition to Gunfighter's Ball, what else have you put out recently?
So we just concluded a Kickstarter early this year for a board game version of Gunfighter's Ball. I guess that would be the best way to describe it, a board game version. So it was clear to me that in order to play Gunfighter's Ball, you have to be engaged in the hobby. And not everybody has the time or inclination to be part of a big hobby. Yeah. So how can we bring this fun experience to people who want to do it more casually? And so board game was the answer to that. And we play tested the dickens out of it for a long time, honed it down to this thing that works as a board game. Nice. And it is really, really fun. I mean, there's no question about it. If you go to the Kickstarter page, Gunfight Royale, and you hear that the name is a bit tongue-in-cheek. So the name is evocative of video games like Team Fortress, where it's a fight to the finish, PUBG, games like that. They're called battle royales, and this is called Gunfight Royale. So, it's got a bit of an ironic name, and it's my son, who's 21. He was really key in helping me convert this thing over to something that would be fun as a board game. It's got a lot of humor in it. It's got the same basic mechanics, but then it has things like dirty trick cards. You can make somebody, you can throw a card that if they're within one space of a horse, the horse bites them or kicks them, You can throw a card that there's one, there's a lot of them that are like a bystander calls out a warning. Now you have a field of vision of 180 degrees, or a tumbleweed blows by and you get cover. You guys, stuff like that. So you get these dirty tricks you can play, and after your character is killed, you can still keep your dirty trick cards and play them throughout the rest of the game. So you can influence the results of the game, help your buddies. It's played in 2 teams generally, or a fight to the finish with each man for himself. The characters are cartoon chibi type characters. There is a proper version in the Gunfighter's Ball, style. Those figures are available, but the game is designed for the cartoon figures, and they're balloon head figures. They're really fun. They look like the way that they used to draw cartoons in the late 1800s, political cartoons and stuff. They were balloon heads. Mm-hmm. They're different than chibis in that they have all the high detail and the realistic detail, but their proportions are just really goofy. And whereas a chibi has the stylized, sort of sleek look without the encrusted detail. So these are different in that respect, but it's the same sort of proportions. Anyway, so you got these iconic little guys, and you have, I think a dozen that come with the basic set. So the Kickstarter page, it's just look for Gunfight Royale on Kickstarter. We're in the pre-order phase now, and we will be until September, and then we'll cut it off at the end of September, and we will have fulfillment happening probably January. Okay. The boxes will be coming in probably in November, and then we have figures. Plastic figures that will be coming in separately, and we're casting our own metal figures right now because there's an upgraded metal version of the figures.
Okay. Wow, that's really cool. And then, of course, we're recording a little earlier, so this will probably be October or so when this episode goes live. So people should be able to find some of your stuff there. And also, I was going to ask you, where can they find Gunfighter's Ball and some of your other things, and I know you have a community on Facebook as well.
Yes. Well, we have our web store, knuckleduster.com, and anybody anywhere in the world can order from it. We also have various retailers. If you Google Gunfighter's Ball, you'll probably find some of them. We have there's Dark Horse Hobbies, and we have Dejour's Treasures, which is a very, very large eBay seller that does a lot of game figures. We have Michigan Toy Soldier, New and Discovery Games, Waterloo Games. We have a bunch of retailers out there that are carrying it. So yeah, a Google search should bring it up somewhere. It's not on Amazon though. Okay. Their requirements are pretty stringent, and it's better off not using them right now. I might use them for the board game, but not for Gunfighter's Ball. Has too many moving parts. But anyway, so our web store, like I say, we will ship anywhere in the world, and we generally get things out either the same day or the next day because this is a full-time operation.
Okay, well, that's great. And I will make sure that I put a link to knuckleduster.com in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening can head over to dicegeeks.com, check out the show notes, and you'll be able to find Knuckleduster and Gunfighter's Ball and the board game as well. Well, Forrest, this was a really fun conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Forrest today. Miniature wargaming, little outside the normal area, but I thought it was important to talk to Forrest because there is a lot of cool stuff going on in that space. And besides, I love learning more and more about the different hobbies that are kind of interconnected with role-playing, and definitely miniature wargaming is right there. It was also fun talking a bit about the Wild West and the Old West and some of the ideas and motifs and things that we see there. As I mentioned in the episode, in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, you will find links to Forrest's company and his miniatures and his Facebook community there. Please check those out. See what Forrest is up to over at Knuckleduster. All right. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. Get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in this mad world of Dice Geeks. All right, guys. I used to give the pitch here. I've been giving it at the front. You know the drill. Like, rate, review, subscribe. Much appreciated. All right. Now, each and every Wednesday, it is an honor to come to you with some awesome new guest and a fantastic interview giving us more insights into the most incredible hobby in the world. I thank you so much for listening, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming!